ready to come crashing back down. Run from my mother, my father, run from the doctors, the lawyers, run from my friends, run from the pushers, and I tried even running from myself. But you can't get away from number one. I got in the car and started racing down the highway faster and faster. As the tide began to catch up to me, I started pulling on the steering wheel harder than I ever pulled before. Sweat began to come from my brow, yet I was freezing. I finally reached up and grabbed the review mirror down and looked in it. My eyes were glazed and sunken into my head. Pimples all over my face. It looked as though my cheekbones are going to poke out through my cheeks. My lips were dried and parched and bleeding. My tongue looked like a piece of shoe leather. The vultures had got me. When great welts and sores break out across your shoulders because the resistance of drugs has collapsed and crashed to the bottom until you need a ladder to reach the bottom. I grabbed the wheel thinking I'm going to end it now and flipped the car over into the ditch. It skidded across the frozen snow. I got out and started running down the highway crying and laughing, but no one cared, no one stopped, no place to go but back into town and back on drugs to try and escape my misery for a few more hours. At 17 years old, I was picked up facing a very serious charge, 3 down from capital murder. I was going to go to jail for 7 to 10 years. It'd be quite a while before I got out, but I was lucky. I only went for a few months, but when I got out of the prison, I was walking back and forth in front of the bus station. And there all of a sudden, right in front of the bus, a carload of my buddies drove up and said, "Hey, Brian, we heard through the grapevine, man, you're getting out. Come on." I got in the car. But that night I was standing in the back of this joint with a high-powered rifle ready to blow somebody's head off if they made the wrong move while we were robbing it, hide up on drugs, even before I realized I was out of jail. For about 9-10 weeks, we went on a crime tour, busting in joints, pushing stiffs, hitting up crokers, robbing jewelry stores, busting in the service stations, everything you could imagine. And at the end of the crime tour, we pulled into my hometown. It was a Sunday night. Everybody was piling out of the car, going up into the bootleggers to celebrate the great haul that we'd just made. They turned and said, "Brian, aren't you coming in?" I said, "Wait a minute. My old man's having church, man. He doesn't even know if I'm still alive or out of jail. I'm going to drop over to the service and let him know how good things are going." As I hit my pocket, I had a roll of $100 bills in one pocket and a roll of narcotics in the other. They said, "Well, hurry back. The horseman, the fuzz, the heat might be on before morning. We'll have to blow town." I said, "Sure, man, I'll only stay a few minutes." I spun around in the middle of the street and shot across town. I jumped out in front of the church and walked in the church. I walked over and sat at the back of the church. I remember instantly my father, as I was sitting down, he stood to his feet and stopped the people singing. With a question mark written all over his face, he said, "Brian." He didn't even know his own son. I shrugged my shoulders as if to say yes. He said, "Bless you," with tear-filled eyes. "It's so good to see you." I'll never forget every person in that church turned around and looked at me. There they saw that thieving, crooking, stealing, dope-pushing, dope-using preacher's son. I thought to myself, "Ah, you bunch of phony hypocrites." Finally, Mr. Kennedy got up to preach the message, and I thought, "Oh, well, I've been here long enough." I got up on my feet and started for the door. As I just went to open the door and leave, I heard something. I spun around and looked at the front. Believe it or not, that preacher stopped in the middle of his message, and he pointed his finger right at me and said, "Brian, Jesus loves you. Won't you let him help you?" I shrugged my shoulders and muttered to myself, "Hey, man, you on some kind of bum trip?" And I walked out the door. Walking down the front steps of the church, all of a sudden somebody grabbed my arm. I turned around, and there the preacher had ran out of the middle of his message after me, and tears was running down his cheeks. He said, "Brian, Jesus loves you. He wants to help you. Something in my heart is telling you that, man, if you don't let him help you, you're going to wish that you did." I grabbed that preacher and threw him down and said, "Hey, man, what's the matter? You're freaking out. Don't shed any tears for me, man. I'm too tough to pray. I don't need God." And I walked over top of him, and I got in the car. I blew across town. I walked into the bootleggers where everybody was sniffing, popping, shooting, getting stoned. They looked up. "Hey, Brian, what's going on?" I said, "I'm doomed for hell. The booger man's gonna get me." Don't laugh. He did. 5 nights later, we were planning an armed robbery. The biggest armed robbery in my hometown. That night I went out and checked for the last time to make sure everything was going to go off like clockwork. It was after midnight, and we were going to stick the joint up at 5:25 just before their May double bank deposit that they made every Saturday morning. As I walked up the stairs of the apartment where I left some of my friends that were going to stick the joint up with me, I heard a shot ring out. I thought, uh-oh, somebody's tripped out. Somebody's freaked out on a bum trip. I ran up the stairs and busted in the door, and I looked. And another guy, Laner, was standing in the washroom door and he pulled the trigger of a high-powered rifle. My buddy had just ducked behind the kitchenette and the slug went into a stack of LPs on the record player and blew them around the room like confetti. I walked in and I said, guys, you're going to have the horsemen, the fuzz, the pigs. The heat's going to be on. We might as well call it off. And they were waiting for me.